Genesis chapter 41, we will be considering verses 40 through 57 today. That's verse 40 through the end of the chapter. We considered last time essentially the installation of Joseph as sort of vice regent, you may say, of Egypt. He was the vizier of Egypt. He was the one in charge of everything except the throne itself. And so that was on through to verse 46, but we're going to back into that a little bit, just so all that's in front of us as we spend the rest of the time today in the remaining part of the chapter. The title of the message today is The Blessing of God's Rule. The blessing of God's rule, or you might say the blessing of God's reign. Either way, it's the same thing what we mean here. The blessing of God's rule. May sound like a curious title for this section, but I trust it's pretty straightforward. This is the time in Egypt where we see God ruling through his man Joseph, and that the turning of Egypt toward God in any way resulted in a tremendous blessing for them. And that's what I want us to see as what is instrumental here and what happens. So that's my aim in this. So the blessing of God's rule. This is one of the greatest points of the whole story as I see it. And it's often missed by an undue emphasis on what is usually seen as the personal triumph of Joseph and rising to a position of power in Egypt. We usually see the whole point of the Joseph story is like he had these dreams and God told him these things and then everything didn't work out, but he kept on believing God and then it worked out in the end. And look at what a great thing happened to Joseph. And we just missed the whole, like, God could have done that in the Promised Land. He didn't need to involve Egypt at all. But he did. And so there's a lot more involved there. Of course, the reason we miss some of these other things that are involved is because we are just seeing it as a story about personal triumph, which it's not a story about that, really, at all. Joseph does not rise to power because of his cunning or his prowess or his skill or his intelligence, or even because he's just obedient to God. None of those things are the reason why Joseph ends up in power in Egypt. Rather, with an enduring hope, he clings to God and to God's Word through a winding road of providence and hardship that was very unexpected. Like a chess champion, God is patiently and masterfully creating the conditions necessary for His Word to beautifully and wonderfully be fulfilled. It's amazing when you see it. But all this is just, you think, why did He do that? Why did He move him there? Why did He put him there? Why did He put that piece there? Just watch. Everything is exactly right. And so this is what's happening. Joseph doesn't come to power because he just deserved it or because he triumphed. God was setting these things in order. Again, it's not about Joseph's triumph, but God's careful providence and His sovereignty and His concern. So this wrong idea of Joseph's story causes people to not only misunderstand the story, but also to miss one of its greatest points. Namely, in this story, as I said, God brings blessing to the world by ruling that world through His man, that man acting in obedience to God. So God finds an obedient man. God blesses the world by ruling the world through an obedient man. Well, that sounds pretty good. This is not the ultimate blessing, however, that Abraham this is not the ultimate blessing of Abraham, which will be lavished upon the nations, but it is a lesser fulfillment of the nations of the earth being blessed by a son of Abraham. Nonetheless, all the world comes to Egypt to Joseph. I'll read that here in a minute. Come to Egypt to Joseph, not just to Egypt. They come specifically to the land because there's this guy there. And from that man, they receive life-sustaining nourishment to get them through. So it's remarkable. The salvation of Egypt from the famine by following a son of Abraham is like training school or elementary school for the greater things to come later from a son of Abraham. Eventually, the people of the world will find a greater source of blessing, which will deliver them from a far greater death than famine. And this story, these events, ought to lay the groundwork for at least later generations of Egyptians to drive again this familiar road of going to a son of Abraham to find blessing from future destruction. They've done it before. God worked it out for them before. And so this is what I hope to share with you. These Egyptians, even others in the world, ought to learn from this that they can safely seek their blessings in Joseph's God rather than Egypt's gods. This deliverance, which was worked for Egypt, has such an impact that the people of Egypt remember it for hundreds of years, and they hold the people of Israel, Joseph's family, in high regard and treat them well so long as the memory of what God did through Joseph is in their heads. We ought to be thinking of Joseph's story as nation-shaping, not just for Israel, but for Egypt. It changed the way, their nation, this event lived on for hundreds of years in the collective memory of that nation. It's incredible. And so we tend to, though, just read it as a somewhat significant story in the family history of Israel, but mainly just something neat about Joseph. God came through for Joseph, and we missed the whole thing. So I hope to keep us from that as we go through here. So the message today is to focus on the blessing of God's rule under Joseph. As we look at this, we'll do so under certain headings. Five things. We'll briefly review the main point of last week's message, very briefly, that Pharaoh actually gave almost all of his authority over to Joseph in order to save the nation. Secondly, we'll consider the ways that Egypt was blessed as a result of this decision. Third, we'll consider the way that this situation is similar to the original created order that we saw in the early chapters of Genesis. Fourth, we'll consider the way that all of this foreshadows the later deliverance that Jesus would bring. And then fifth, I want to jump back into some things here in the story and consider the personal blessing of Joseph through all this process. It's not just that he brings blessing to others, but God blesses him too. He gets in on things too, in special ways. And so we'll consider that, and then we'll just make a very brief, but I hope pointed application. So with all of that said, let's read then Genesis chapter 41, verses 40 through 56. Verse 40, "You," this is Pharaoh speaking, "shall be over my house, and all my people shall order themselves as you command. Only as regards the throne will I be greater than you." And Pharaoh said to Joseph, "See, I have set you over all the land of Egypt." And then Pharaoh took his signet ring from his hand and put it on Joseph's hand, and clothed him in garments of fine linen, and put a gold chain about his neck. And he made him ride in his second chariot. And they called out before him, "Bow the knee." Thus he set him over all the land of Egypt. Moreover, Pharaoh said to Joseph, "I am Pharaoh, and without your consent," that is, without Joseph's consent, "no one shall lift up hand or foot in all the land of Egypt." And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphenath-Paneah, and he gave him in marriage Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On. So Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Or in this way, Joseph went out over the land of Egypt. Verse 46, Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. During the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt, and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potipharah, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of his firstborn Manasseh, for, he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. The name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come. As Joseph had said, there was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph. What he says to you, do." So when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt, to Joseph, to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I want to ask you to take these words, make them alive to us, make them real, cause us to see things in colors we've not seen them before, to understand this text with a real clarity and precision, to sense what's happening here, that we might be transformed by it, that it would stay with us in a lasting and meaningful way. We know all these things are written for our instruction and our benefit, and so we ask for those things, to be instructed, to receive benefit, to leave here better and improved as a result of the things we've considered here today. So help us in this. Amen. Well, first thing, just to review, remember from last time that Egypt, I said, was given to Joseph. And I think you see that never so clearly than in a couple details in verses 40 through 45. The first one would be Pharaoh just says, everyone will order themselves at your command. We looked at literally, that was they'll kiss your lips, right? Or kiss your mouth. It's so when you speak, they purse their lips and quiet their mouth and don't object, don't suggest anything. They just, yes sir, and we do it, right? Or another way to take that was that when he spoke, at his word, they kissed the ground. And those are all just kind of ways of trying to understand these words that are being used there, the idioms that are used, and how that might mean what we know it clearly means, that they order themselves at his command and as he commands. He says, only as regards the throne will I be greater than you. And the only place I can think where that really is a living reality in the world today, as I know it, is I think about things like they have in England, where they have a royal figurehead who is just that. But in all reality, the prime minister and the parliament, they're the ones who actually run everything. But there's this one who everyone still reveres, only insofar as the throne, and that's really it. They have the title, they sit on the throne, they wear the crown on certain occasions, they live in the palace, but really, we don't need you for any of this. You're just kind of here. And it was a temporary thing, certainly. Pharaoh wasn't abdicating his kingship. He still wanted to be king, very much so, but there's a real sense in which he just said, look, if this is the way it is, then you just run it. And we'll trust that it's going to turn out all right. And it did. But this is the way it is. So he's just given, in a sense, the keys to the kingdom. And you see that also in verse 41. He says again, I have set you over all the land of Egypt, everything. Many times in Egypt's history, we have historians and archaeologists who have looked, and they've seen times where a Pharaoh would appoint someone to a specific role, and with regards to that, they were number one in charge. The issue here is the issue here was it's the survival of the nation over the next period of the next 14 years. he's in charge, and he just gets reign over everything. His duties aren't specifically defined to certain small specific things, but just whatever he needs, whatever he wants, he gets it. And Pharaoh didn't write a letter and then take his ring and put it in the wax and seal it up and say, there, it's official from me. This guy gets what he asks for. He took the ring off and said, here, whatever you want. It's like the keys to the kingdom. I mean, you have the king's signet ring. There's no difference between now whatever you have written down and press in the seal, and they could say, well, that didn't come from Pharaoh. I've got his ring. I have the authority. You don't need to talk to Pharaoh. I'm in charge. The only thing, the difference between me and Pharaoh is he happens to be sitting on the throne. But for all practical purposes, I have the ring, I have the garments, I have the chain, I ride in the chariot. Everyone cries out when I drive by, bow the knee, I am in charge. He was just given the whole thing. It's incredible. We tend to think Joseph was just kind of put in charge of storing food, but that's not the way it is. It was way bigger than that. And so it's truly remarkable. It upset the whole nation. I don't mean that everyone in the nation was upset about it. I just mean it turned everything upside down and around. And so we have that. Those things I want to make clear. Now, having done that, what would the result be? I mean, it's one thing. We see Pharaoh got these dreams. God's giving him a message about what's going to come and what he should do, but he doesn't understand it. Then Joseph delivers the message to him. The question is, what will Pharaoh do? Pharaoh responds by giving it all to Joseph. Now the question is, well, will it turn out? Will it pan out? Was that the right move? You could imagine everyone in Pharaoh's court. He's lost his mind. What are we doing? But they dare not cross him. And so it's a frightening thing in a sense. That if you were told, look, it's going to go really well for the next 7 years, but after that, the 7 years that follow are going to be devastating. And no matter how much you store up or what you do or how good those first 7 years are, trust me, you can't imagine how bad it's going to get at the end of the 7 years. You're going to have forgotten. There will be nothing left of all the good things. There won't be anything left. You'd think, well, one, what do I need to do to prepare and store up what I can and make ready for this? But two, is this really going to happen? Right? Is it really going to happen? And you're kind of frightening. And are we going to be able to prepare well enough? And he put this guy in charge, and I hope he knows what he's doing. So how does it work? Was Joseph the right man for the job? Well, he was, because he was God's man for the job. Just like everything else, God blessed everything that Joseph was under in his hands, and God blessed this, and it worked out wonderfully. And so here we go. So let's just consider the blessing of Egypt under God's man. This is kind of what these verses are about. Joseph was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Notice the way it says that. Now, we just talked about him being in charge of everything, but he's in charge of everything. He holds it in trust. Right? It's not just, here, you be king now, I'm no longer Pharaoh. But Pharaoh says, I trust you with everything. Do well. So how well will Joseph do? How well will he serve Pharaoh? You see, he's serving God, yes, but he's serving God and he's serving Pharaoh. He was 30 years old when he entered the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. So the question is, we might say, here's Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He needs someone to help him, and he's chosen as the one to put in charge as the only guy in the kingdom who serves God. Is that going to be a good choice? Is that going to be a good choice? Well, here's Joseph in the service of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went through all the land of Egypt. And during the 7 plentiful years, the earth produced abundantly, just as God said it would. He would bring these 7 years of blessing first. It produced abundantly, right? I mean, hand over fist. It's just incredible. And he gathered up all the food of these 7 years, which again could mean all the food, meaning all the food on Pharaoh's properties that were owned everywhere Pharaoh could lawfully, without doing something different than had already existed, have all the land from that. Or it means, and that was all divided in fifths, or it means he's taking a 20% tax of all the land. Right? Nonetheless, here it is. So he gathered up all the food of these 7 years which occurred in the land of Egypt and put the food in the cities. He put in every city the food from the fields around it. So you've got a city, typically this would be done, you have a fortified place, right? And there's lots of things that are grown inside the city walls, but mostly that's where most of the people live and commerce is done and things like that. And but outside of that, there's all these fields that are irrigated because they're nearby where you have a water source and that kind of thing. And this is what you do. And you go out into those fields and you harvest and you bring things back inside the walls. That's typically the kind of thing that's done. So inside the walled cities, inside there, Joseph is, he's either added on to the city or he's done whatever he's had to do. He's built storehouses that are massive and he's filling them up with all the food that they gather from these fields around each city. And Joseph stored up grain in great abundance, like the sand of the sea, until he ceased to measure it, for it could not be measured. There was no counting. There was no counting of any of this. It was too much. Now that's incredible. I mean, you're talking about an ancient society that took records of everything, and they just gave up. It's too much. I mean, that's kind of amazing. I mean, let's say, some of you maybe have seen some massive grain silos and storage silos around in this area. We are in the Midwest. They know how much is in there. They know exactly how much is in there. They put it on a barge and send it down. They know how much got on the barge, right? So, you could imagine if we had a building like this and we started bringing in sacks of grain, it wouldn't be that hard to keep record of how many sacks of grain. You've got it. You're in charge of everyone. Just put a guy in charge of it. He put a tally mark or whatever, right? It's just real simple. You could easily find out how many bags of grain are here. No problem. That they couldn't count. You'd say, well, maybe they must have had it all in one place and just somebody lost the notes or something, right? It couldn't be done. And it wasn't like, how big are these cities? Maybe you have 1,000 people in a city, 2,000 people, 400 people, 100 people. How big are your cities? They're not massive. And in that city, they've got a place they're putting all the grain, just the extra stuff, because they're eating like crazy for these 7 years. Things are great. Just the overflow they're putting in there. And they got a building so big, they lost track years ago about how much is in there. You couldn't even bother to count. You could go take 100 bags of grain and no one would ever know. Now we keep it, we've got it secured, but it's like there's just so much. What are you going to do? This is how much grain is coming in. He stored up grain in great abundance like the sand of the sea. Now Angela and I were just at the beach the other week, and we had that comment. It was like counting. I just took a handful of sand and I was like, I don't know, 10,000, 100,000, a million? It's so fine. I don't know. Like the sand of the sea. That's how much grain we're talking about, right? And not to say that it's an equivalent amount, but just it's like that. You can't even bother to count. Forget it. A lot. More than we would think we would ever need. This is the way it is. Joseph stored up grain in great abundance. Wouldn't the temptation be after you got there and you built these huge buildings and we got them full and you can't get any more, to think, I think we're good. Not what he did. If God is, He's wise. He's like, if God is continuing to bless us with this much, He said the famine is going to be bad, so we better keep storing it up. So you build another place, and you get another place. And you think, well, what about that city? Well, there's not a lot of fields there. Well, we better put something there, and let's haul it out there. Let's do whatever. We've got to store as much of the stuff as we can. And He stores so much that we see later, it not only protects Egypt, but there's people from all over the known world, the region there, that are coming in, getting food, and everybody has enough. It's incredible. He was the right man. Somebody else would have spent it off and just wasted it all in parties and feasts and festivals and done all kinds of things. Look how wonderful it is. And you say, well, shouldn't we be storing it up? All our grain storage is full. We've never had more. So we're just going to keep living high on the hog. That's not what happened. He diligently preserved it. All the blessing. The surplus wasn't for wasting. It was for preparing. Now, Before the year of famine. It says the year of famine. But look at verse 54. And the 7 years of famine began to come. So I think the idea is, I think we're supposed to understand that sometime during the 7 years of plenty, these sons were born. Before the first of the years of famine. But it could be, I'm just saying it seems possible to me that the year of famine could have been like year 3 of the bad years, or that was kind of known as the year of it got really, really bad then. It was bad, but it took a worse turn. I don't think that's the way we're meant to take it, but I just say I feel like that's maybe possible. The year of famine could be one of the worst of the 7 years, or something like that. It does seem to me, though, as famines tend to go, the longer they go, the worse they get. So it's not like the worst would be year 3. That might be year 2 might have been where it dropped off, and maybe that's the kind of we think of that's the really bad year. But nonetheless, you would think if year 2 was that bad, year 3 would be worse. Year 4, 5, 6, 7, it just keeps getting worse. And so, anyway, this is before that year happened, before that year came, right? He had these 2 sons given to him. Now, we'll look at that in a minute. But we considered Egypt under Joseph during years of blessing. Let's consider Egypt under Joseph during these years of famine, because we're talking here about the blessing of being under Joseph during this whole time. Verses 50 through 52 are just about Joseph's personal blessing. I want to continue to look at and not take our gaze off how Egypt is faring under Joseph. So, verse 53. The 7 years of plenty that occurred in the land of Egypt came to an end, and the 7 years of famine began to come, as Joseph had said. There was famine in all lands. So it was a widespread famine. Now, we can stop there for a minute. How does famine come typically? I mean, we usually think of famine as being caused by what? Anybody want to take a stab? Drought. No rain. Right, exactly. A drought. Well, you could have a drought in Egypt, but with the Nile River, it's not going to be terrible. You're going to have water. There's no mention ever about in this about Egypt not having water. Like, they've got all the water. There are other things that can cause drought. What are other things that can ruin a crop? Lack of rain. What else? Okay, locusts could be, very possible. That's one, Wes. Disease, right? What did you say? Hail. There's all kinds of things that could happen, right? So evidently it's not, it's not just that there's nothing that's so dry. We also read, remember, Pharaoh in his dream, he said these things were, the 7 years of grain were blighted by the east wind. I mean, it was like, so maybe literally the east wind came through in such a way that hot desert wind came in and just burned up the crops year after year after year. I don't know. That's possible. But it's not just Egypt, it's the whole land, which might mean something like not much rain up there, or weather all out of season and out of sorts, hail, locusts, whatever it may be. It could be all kinds of things. Nonetheless, for one reason or another, or for all sorts of various reasons, there was famine in all lands. But in all the land of Egypt there was bread. It wasn't just, remember Joseph didn't store it up in just 3 or 4 store cities. He stored it up in every city. He had places. So, in all the land of Egypt, there was bread. You just had to get to his town where there was a field and you could have plenty of food to eat. No problem. Right? Now, it also seems like this famine was first hit outside of Egypt and then came to Egypt in a worse way. Here's what I mean. It hasn't yet started telling us about Joseph selling all this land. There was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So even though it's true that you could have famine everywhere and you can go to a storehouse, any of these store cities in Egypt, and get bread, it doesn't seem like that's exactly what's being talked about here. there was famine in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. When all the land of Egypt was famished, eventually got to that point. Does that make sense? Eventually, so it started out as famine everywhere, and then it got to where then all the land of Egypt was famished. And so then what did the people do? Hey, it's time to open the storehouses, right? Then the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. They got to the point where people started coming to Pharaoh saying, we need help. And Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, every time someone would come, he'd tell them this, all the Egyptians, go to Joseph. What he says to you, do. Here's something significant too. He says go to Joseph. He doesn't say go to Zaphenath-Paneah. Go to Joseph. He calls him by his Hebrew name, which I think at least is meant in our mind to remind us that Joseph is connected to God. Like there's this, it's not the Egyptian. At least Moses is trying to get us to remember Joseph, we're to view Joseph here as in connection with his God. It might mean that the lips of Pharaoh also said the word Joseph. Right? That might very well mean that. I don't have any reason to think it didn't, but it definitely at least means Moses is wanting us to remember Joseph not as Zaphenath-Paneah, but as Joseph. And so, go to Joseph, what he says to you, do. So, when the famine had spread over all the land, Joseph then opened all the storehouses, right? Everything. It was just open and wide. Whatever's in there, come on and get it. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt. Opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, for the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. Moreover, all the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So, it looks like the Egyptians are faring pretty well. I mean, they've done well. They've got all this produce, all this abundance. Famine comes in the region. They're kind of the last ones who it hits. But when it hits, boy, does it hit hard. They go to Pharaoh. What are we going to do? We've got nothing. And Pharaoh says, there was the man. You all know him. You go to Joseph. And whatever he says, you need to do that. And Joseph says, okay, open them up. We're open for business, right? And he starts selling grain at fair prices, right? So he's providing them with that. And then it's so they've got it, but then people get word, hey, there is food in Egypt. And they start coming from all the lands. And you wonder, is there going to be enough? Are we going to make it through the 7 years? Well, there is enough. We find that out later in the story. But there's enough all the way through. All the earth came to Egypt to Joseph to buy grain, because the famine was severe over all the earth. So there's tremendous blessing. I mean, yeah, you've got to go buy it. You're not growing it yourself, but it's available. Everybody else, there's nothing. I mean, if you're living and living in Hebron, and you ran out of food that day, or that month, that year, what are we doing for food, guys? There's nothing. Our kids are dying. That's what's happening. We're dying of famine, starvation. It's not good. But I've heard that there's food down there in Egypt. Let's make the couple weeks journey and get down there and see if maybe we can exchange something for some grain so we can live. The Egyptians have it right there in their town. Just walk across the street. Go get it. Continue on. Things are good. So, anyway, this is the idea here. So Egypt has done very, very well for itself by submitting themselves to God's man and listening to His words, doing what He says. Now, I said that all of this, I think, is sort of a callback to what we find in Genesis 1 and 2 and the pattern there. Consider these things. In obedience to God and in relationship with God, back in Genesis 1 and 2, in obedience to God and in relationship with God, man was meant to rule the world and to exercise dominion. That dominion and that rule was to bring the blessing and the order of God's garden paradise into the wider world, which was not yet at that time ordered in such a way as to experience that blessing. Remember, there was the garden that God made, this walled-off area where things were amazing. From that garden there flowed this river out into the world, and there's all these riches in the world because of the river. God says, go out there into all the world and subdue it and exercise dominion. So they were to go out and maybe there were these animals out there that, man, they were doing okay, but they weren't doing great. Or there was this land and it's just kind of dry and it seemed like it could produce so much more if somebody would irrigate it. So, what did man do? Man went out there. He was to go out there and to work that field and to make it, to subdue that land. To plant these trees over here and over there and to reshape the land over here and create a drainage ditch this way and water this area and do all these sorts of things. He used to go out there and do those things. So he was to bring the blessing and the order of God's garden paradise into the wider world, which was not at that time ordered in such a way as to experience that blessing. Both the land and the animals would benefit from this order and this blessing being brought to the wider world. It needed to be subdued by man's efforts and man's ingenuity, man's creativity. They needed, some of these animals perhaps needed the blessing of a tender, caring, gentle, interested caregiver. Right? This is what was to be done. This was the pattern. How similar is that to all this, to Egypt? They're in this famine. Things aren't going to go well. They're going to die. There's this guy Joseph who's in charge. And because he's in charge, what does he do? He brings blessing to the nations. They don't have what they need. They can't eat this way. There's not sufficient water, or there's disease, or whatever it is that's happening. The land isn't producing what it should be to be a blessing to the people. But go to Joseph. He'll provide it. Right? He was able to manage the 7 years of blessing in such a way that the blessing can go on and be given to people when they can't get it for themselves. But take all of Egypt and order it under God's man, and that man will bring God's blessing to the nation. That's what happens with Joseph. Now, all of this, I say, that's all I wanted to say on that section, is a foreshadowing to a greater future redemption that's coming, right? A whole redemption. God is bringing, think about this now. Think about, this is kind of the message to the Egyptians, and think about, as I word this, how similar this is to what we would say for the gospel and what God does through Jesus Christ. God has a message for you. He's bringing devastation and death upon you all. It's coming. It's certain. God is determined. He's telling you now what's going to happen. He's bringing devastation and death upon you all. God has demonstrated to you that you are helpless to deliver yourself from what He's bringing upon you. Just like He did with Pharaoh. He was totally helpless. You are helpless to avoid this. It's simply coming. God has also, however, provided an opportunity for you to escape this destruction. A message that makes for peace. This way of escape comes to you through a message that must be believed and obeyed. This message, which must be believed and obeyed, this way of escape, requires you to recognize the superiority and the fitness for the task of the man that He has appointed to deliver you. If you put the wrong guy in charge, you submit to the wrong person, it's not going to work. So there's certain destruction that's coming, devastation and death. You're helpless to deliver yourself from what He's bringing you. There is a way to escape. In order to escape, you have to listen and obey this listen to and obey this message and believe it. Also, in order to get out, you have to recognize that there is someone, a man who can deliver you, and you have to recognize that he's the man for the job, and you got to submit to him. God's deliverance requires you to submit everything under your authority to His authority. You have to in a manner of speaking, take your ring off and give it to him and let him decide what happens. Now, one stark difference here is there is no save the throne. I'm still going to sit on the throne, but you can, like, that's not, okay, it's not a perfect picture, but it's a significant one. And lastly, God's deliverance is certain and is absolutely sure if you would just heed the message and obey it. That's it. Just obey what He's telling you to do. Just go do this. Turn things over to Him and you'll be delivered. That's exactly what happens. Now that is a massive picture of the gospel, of how someone might be saved. You've got to recognize these things as real and true. You've got to listen to the message. You've got to believe this thing. You've got to see Christ as the only one fit to deliver you, as superior to anything else. You've got to take your ring off and say, here it is, you're in charge. Whatever you say to do, however we can get out of this, let's do it. This is the reality. And if you do those things, it's absolutely certain. You'll be saved. Delivered from the destruction and the devastation and the death that's to come. So it's so similar, this man Joseph, and how Egypt fares under his rule because of God's favor. And it's just so curious, isn't it? I mean, why? It's so strange when you think about it, that God decided to do this. I mean, He could have just preserved Joseph's family. But He did it in this way. He sent him to Egypt as a slave, as a nobody. And then He put Pharaoh in this situation where, there's a lot of things happening in between there, but then He puts Pharaoh in this situation where he's totally undone and he needs some help. And there's a nobody who happens to be the only guy who can answer his questions. And he gets called in. He gets summoned in. Because he's just in prison. And he can just come in. Pharaoh can just call him in, no problem. And God gives him an interpretation. And then he's put in charge. And that's a shocking thing. And all this happens, and it preserves, it provides a place of nourishment and sustenance for the people of Israel, a land where they can dwell freely. They don't have to be at war with the people up in Canaan. They're not going to, you can see the people of Israel, they are not going to be any good. This is amazing. They're up there in the land of Canaan kind of mingling. They're already intermarrying and stuff. They're not really sticking very true and faithfully to God. It's a problem. Those people in that society are getting ready to go off the deep end even worse than they are, and God's going to bring judgment upon them in a few hundred years. It's not good. He wants to get His people out of there. He gets them out of there, brings them to a place of wealth and opulence. But you don't want to mixing with those people too. Well, guess what? When the Israelites come down there, they're an abomination to the Egyptians. The Egyptians want nothing to do with them. Stay away. So you guys go over there in that land. We're going to stay over here and you just do your thing. And for 400 years, they just prosper like that. And then all of a sudden, things go bad. They cry out to God. God delivers them. They're back in the land. And, it's time to destroy those people now. They deserve it. It's amazing how God works all this stuff out. You couldn't have planned it this way. You or I could not have done that. It's so amazing that God does this. But then not only does He do it, but He does it in ways that are patterned after His original creation order. And He does it in ways that are patterned after how He will bring deliverance later to the whole world in terms of His own Son, Jesus Christ. It's remarkable. Now, in all of this, we see God's blessing brought to others, but I want us to see how Joseph himself is not forgotten in this blessing being brought to others. And so let's consider some verses we skipped over here, verses 50, 51, and 52. Let's read those. Before the year of famine came, 2 sons were born to Joseph. Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore them to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, for he said, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. And the name of the second he called Ephraim, for God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. Now, these two boys, each one is very significant. There's no sense in which they're twins. There's definitely one who's older than the other, it seems rather significantly. There's some time. They're born as kids are. There's some months between them. The first one he names Manasseh. Manasseh, right? Sound doesn't mean forget, but it sounds like the Hebrew for forget, right? And he says, I give him that name because God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. We could ask the question, what does he mean? Well, he does not mean that he has literally forgotten about all his father's house and does not care about them or his family and their special place in the world. He can't mean that for a number of reasons. Clearly, he does not mean that because he gives his son a Hebrew name, not an Egyptian one. He hasn't turned his back and said, forget all that. I'm done with that. He gives his son a Hebrew name, a name particularly to indicate his ongoing connection with God. God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. It also can't mean that he's forgotten all about his father's house, because years later when his brothers come, he remembers everything very, very well. He remembers what they were like. He remembers what the birth order was. He knows all of those things. Who did what? He remembers very clearly. Right? 22 years later, and he hadn't forgotten one of their faces. He didn't confuse any of his brothers at all. Think about that. I mean, there's people, I'm 41. Joseph was 39 when he sees his brothers again. He'd last seen them when he was 17. So that's 22 years. I last saw people I went to high school with, most of them, when I was 19, just before I was 19. I'm now 41. It's 22 years. There are people from my high school that I've seen their pictures on Facebook or something, and I've not recognized them at all. I'm like, that cannot be them. Or you see the name and you're like, what? And you look again, right? There were people that way at the 10-year reunion pictures that I could not recognize. They changed so much. Joseph, in these 22 years, not only does he see these people and think, oh, maybe that kind of looks like my brother. He just remembers every brother, puts them in birth order, all of that. He remembers these things. He hasn't forgotten all about his father's house. He's kind of linking these things together. I forgot all about my hardship in my father's house. You could almost, it's not, he doesn't limit it to his father's house, but you could almost think of it, all my hardship in my father's house. All the hardship that led out of my father's house, that came from the things that happened. All my hardships that started in and have flowed out of my experience in my father's house. This is the kind of thing that he's meaning here. But for himself to give him the name, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house, clearly indicates that for Joseph, his heart is set on God and what God is doing in the world. So when he says God has made him forget all the ways that those in his father's house had treated him, he has not forgotten in the sense that he's not able to recall these things and bring them up. But he's not making a memorial to them. He's not living in the bitterness of that. He's not living in the what ifs. Oh, what could have happened? What should have done? Or the things that should have happened and could have been. He's not living in that way. In his father's house, he had met with constant trouble from his brothers. And both then and even now in Egypt, he has known regular and severe hardships. It's not been easy. But now that God has delivered him and blessed him and even given him now even a son, he's so overcome by gratitude and by love for God that he decides to publicly and enduringly give testimony to the world about God's kindness to him. To restore hope and life and good things to those who have suffered. He says, I'm going to name my son Forget. Right? Some of us might think we've got children that could also be named Forgetful, maybe, right? But he names him Forget, not because the son forgets, but because God has treated him so well and shown him one act of kindness and grace after another, that even though things had been so hard, that he now can just say, listen, I've forgotten all that. God has made me forget those things. Why did you forget? Well, because things turned out for me here. No, God moved into my life in ways that we could talk about those things, and I could tell you how bad it was, but honestly, I just don't even think about it anymore, because God has been so kind to me now. What a testimony. He names his child with the words, God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house. Think of this. Joseph we're not told that he went around and told everybody this, but it's not like he was hiding it. When he was in prison and he spoke with that cupbearer, he said, remember me and how I was wrongly sold into slavery. And even now, even having been a slave, I'm wrongly imprisoned. It's not unreasonable to think that those people who knew Joseph, now that he's in a position of power, have heard these things from him. That he was wrong, that he was stolen and put into slavery when he shouldn't have been a slave. And even as a slave, he was falsely accused and wrongly imprisoned. People know these things. Now, we know some stories. I mean, they're all publicized all the time. When someone, they spent 20 years in prison, we find out they were wrongly convicted. We think, how can this be? Right? Some of those people end up saying things like Joseph, God's made me forget all that. A lot of them are pretty bitter. They sue. They do all kinds of things. Right? Not Joseph. God made me forget all that. I'm not worried about it. I don't dwell on those things in a way that is bitter or resentful. So, he wants people to know his whole life story, those that know him, those that might know what he named his son, right? If you're close enough to someone, you might know what their son's name is. He wants to make sure they know that God has made him forget all that, right? Because think about it. It could be that you say, well, God has been really good to us through Joseph, but he sure wasn't good to Joseph. I mean, God has not been good to Joseph. Look what he lost. And Joseph says, look, I forgot all that. You need to understand. It's like we think about Job. We think, well, God put him through all those things. Well, listen, Job blessed God at the end of everything. So however much we might take issue or feel like, well, I don't know if I'd be okay with that. Well, the one he was dealing with was okay by the time it was all over and said, praise be to God. And here's Joseph, and he's doing the same thing. All these things have happened to him. Man, it seems so hard. And long before his brothers have ever come about and he sees his brothers, he's totally made peace with it, and he's blessing God and saying, God, maybe forget all that stuff. And then the next son he has, Ephraim, right? Fruitful. God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. This statement goes even further than the last one. Not only has God made him forget about his hardships in his family and all those many years, but God has also, in addition to that, made him fruitful. It's not just that I forgot the bad things. I'm currently enjoying all kinds of wonderful things. He's made him fruitful. Now, that word fruitful here, I think, is probably meant in two ways. Or you might say it's meant in the fullest possible sense. Likely, he at least means fruitful in the sense of having children, of multiplying and being fruitful in that sense. Right? He's now had more than one child. He's got multiple children. He's being fruitful. God has made me fruitful. In a society like this one and like all ancient ones, and even somewhat like our own, having children is a big deal. Right? Abraham can say to God, what's my reward? I don't know how I continue without a son. I got this servant. He's going to get it all. I got nothing. You haven't done, you've done a lot of things for me, but it's as though you've done nothing because I don't have a kid. And here Joseph can say, after all that he lost, and then all that he's gained, and all the power that he's had, and the influence, and all that he's been blessed with, he's got a son. And then now he's got another son. He says, God has made me fruitful. Right? He's multiplying in that sense. But the second thing, which he likely also means, is fruitful in terms of prosperity and success. God is blessing those things that are in his responsibility. Things are turning out beautifully for him. now that he's in the position he's in. He's been given this task, and it's going remarkably well. And then he's got this wife, and he's got these kids now, and things are going well. He's been fruitful. There was a time where he thought maybe he'd never be fruitful at all. But now he's fruitful. It's remarkable in that this child also is given a Hebrew name. What is more, Joseph credits God, not Egypt, with blessing and fruitfulness. He doesn't say, now I'm fruitful in this land of abundance. He says, God made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. He doesn't give Egypt any credit at all. It's crazy. I mean, these fields which are yielding so much produce, farmland costs a lot over in Illinois. It costs a lot in Missouri too, but a lot more in Illinois because it's more fertile there. He doesn't say, now that I'm in Egypt, because of this land and that Nile River and all these things are just working out, things are really going well. He calls Egypt the land of his affliction. Things are terrible here in Egypt, but in spite of that, God is making me fruitful. Right? And just think about this. Where would Joseph be in all this if it weren't for God? Okay, so let's take God out of the equation for a minute. Joseph gets down there to Egypt. He's a slave. He never would have even got in Potiphar's good graces. But perhaps, maybe, Potiphar's wife still cast eyes on him and she lies about things. And then he's cast off in jail. There's no interpretations. He's just stuck there forever. Now, how's he going to fare as a prisoner during famine? Not very well. But instead, because when Joseph went down to Egypt, God was there and brought him there. God was there ahead of him. And God was there with him. The difference is he's fruitful. In this land of his affliction, God has made him fruitful. The difference is God, not Egypt. The difference is God. It's amazing that Joseph calls this Egypt, where he's surrounded by opulence and wealth and blessing, as the land of his affliction. As one commentator put it, with the second name, Ephraim, Joseph makes it clear that he's not just giving a nod to his heritage when he names his kids. He's identifying himself as a Hebrew among Egyptians. End quote. Now, I wanted to say this here in closing about Joseph and these names here. Like his fathers before him, so too with Joseph. Think about it. The author of the Hebrews mentions even the way that Abraham and some of his descendants lived by faith. And among the comments he makes as he describes them, he speaks of their faith in God, causing them to seek their future with God rather than seeking to build something on the earth. And he says, the author of the Hebrews says, for people who speak thus, people who speak in this way, make it clear that they are seeking a homeland. They're seeking some other place to live. And I'll say, and so is Joseph. Joseph is wealthy in Egypt. He's ruling the nation, but yet he speaks in a very different manner. He doesn't speak like one who's at home with the Egyptians, but one who's a sojourner. He speaks like a man of God. And so we can look at the record of these people's lives, like Abraham and like Joseph. And along with the author to the Hebrews, we can say, quote, but as it is, right, as I look at things, as it is, they desire a better country, that is a heavenly one. And therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for He has prepared for them a city. I mean, Joseph has everything he could want in Egypt, but he's identifying himself not with the Egyptians, but with God and with his family and all that God had promised to do. Now, so just to summarize things here, the main point of the text is the Pharaoh had made the right decision by putting God's man in charge, right? Egypt was tremendously blessed as a result of listening and obeying those things that Joseph told them to do. It was the right thing. So for Egypt, putting Joseph in charge meant securing blessing. It meant enjoying blessing. It meant massive benefits, right, to them. But for Joseph, all of this, he wasn't left out of the equation. He also was blessed, right? As just, he was there as a channel of blessing for others, but not just a channel. He got things too, specific things for him. So that he had forgotten all of his hardship and all that had happened in his father's house. And his testimony was that God had made him fruitful. So both things. You just see the goodness of God here. His faithful testimony to the Egyptians, the way he blessed them through this man, but then also his blessing upon that man himself. And so the application I want to make is just to appreciate that God is this way. Like that's just the way God is. Like he's caring enough to bring blessing even upon this pagan nation that deserve his wrath. But he wants to teach them something about himself. He wants to give them a testimony and a witness for them and for future generations, that they might turn to him. They're out there groping in the dark, and he's going to shine a little light their way, that they might see. What a kind God. And in order to do it, you say, well, what's he going to do? He's going to make this guy a slave for all these years and throw him in prison. It's like, oh no. Right? But he's going to do so well by that man. That man's going to bless God. God has made me forget all that, and I'm so fruitful. And if I had a choice to do it again, I'd choose God again. He's my God. I don't want any of this stuff. I want God. There are not many people who have nothing, who you could make king and give everything, who would say, really, this isn't really the big thing. I want God. Joseph was that guy. It's amazing. He had experienced from God some of the worst things that a person can go through, and he knew God was doing it to him. And he had experienced some of the greatest wealth and privilege that you can have in the world. And he's choosing God. He's saying, I'm with God. God has made me forget the bad things. God has made me fruitful. I just want to love God for being this kind of way. And he's this way with us, right? So God not only brings blessing to the undeserving nations, but he's personally good to the ones that he uses to bless them. Right? There's enough goodness in God to bless all of them. It's not like, well, I've got a blessing for them, but that means you don't get it. That's not how this works. This is God's way. I mean, the New Testament teaches us he's this way with finances, right? Give. And you'll find that what? God here's the sower, and he's scattering his seed, and God continues to supply seed to the sower. He won't be outdone. Right? You say, well, I'm going to bless others with these things. Okay. Don't worry. God will see to it that you're blessed. You don't need to worry about that. Right? Open the storehouses to all the world. That's fine. There's plenty. God's got enough. It's this way. Right? You risk much for the sake of the kingdom. God's with you. Right? Some of them they will kill. Some of you they will kill. Right? That'll happen. God's with you. There are no regretful martyrs. Right? No sacrifice goes unseen and unrewarded by God. Whether you choose that sacrifice for yourself or he chooses it for you, none of these sacrifices go unnoticed and unrewarded by God. This is the way that he is. And it's not just a monetary exchange. Well, I did these things. Well, you owe me. Okay, thank you. Make sure you're not, you're doing what you're supposed to do here. That's not it. He does it in ways that you turn to him and say, really? All this? Oh, forget I even ever mentioned that stuff. I'm so fruitful now. You're so good and kind to me. Joseph can say that? Yep, Joseph can. Well, that's all I have today. Are there questions or comments?